Welcome to Fort Laramie National Historic Site, the Embassy on the Plains. Fort Laramie has been a gathering place of nations and diverse cultures for centuries. From the gathering of the great tribal nations of the Northern Great Plains, to the immigrant trails, the fur trading post, the military post, the bastion on the plains, to the homesteading era, Fort Laramie is the story of who we are. The visitor at Fort Laramie can have a tremendous amount of experiences, whether it be a ranger program, a guided tour of this great post, or a historic weapons demonstration. I hope visitors will walk away with a sense of themselves. I hope they will find an identity with places like Fort Laramie. Why am I here? Because the story of Wyoming is the American story, and there's no greater place to tell that than Fort Laramie. That's why.
Fort Laramie is one of the most important sites in the history of the American West. For over 50 years, it provided support for major events like the fur trade, the westward emigration, the gold rushes, and the Indian Wars. It all began because there was a need for a post to trade with Indians and fur trappers. Originally called Fort William, it soon became known as Fort Laramie because it is located where the Laramie River flows into the North Platte. The fur trade declined, but the fort prospered by supplying the wagon trains that followed the Platte River Trail to Oregon, California, and Utah in the 1840s and 50s. The roster of colorful folks who visited the fort reads like a who's who of the 19th century West. Jim Bridger, the Whitmans, Father De Smet, Kit Carson, John C. Frémont, Francis Parkman, William Cody, to name a few. In 1849, the Army bought the fort. Thereafter, it was used as a site for major treaties with the Indians and as a staging base for military campaigns against them. The bachelor officers' quarters, affectionately called Old Bedlam, was prominent among the buildings that surrounded the parade ground. On Christmas night of 1866, the ghostly figure of Portuguese Phillips stumbled into Old Bedlam. Near death after a 300-mile ride in the sub-zero weather, he reported the Fetterman Massacre. With the end of the Indian Wars in 1890 and the coming of the railroad, there was no need for Fort Laramie. It fell into disrepair and was scavenged by the locals until it was designated a National Historic Site and partially restored by the National Park Service. Whatever your historical perspective, Fort Laramie deserves recognition as one of Wyoming's special places. I'm Gene Gade of the University of Wyoming Cooperative Extension Service.
is so that so that girls would learn how to become graceful while they were growing up. But soldiers eventually started playing it too as a competitive thing. So you would have your hoop, and usually ribbon would be tied to it so that you could see where it's going. And then 2 sticks, and you uncross them, and it like flies out, and the other person tries to catch it with their sticks. And that was a very, very liked game on the trail through the whole time. But it's really fun, and it would just, especially for times while you were walking on the trail alongside the wagon, because you would walk with the wagon unless you were sick or pregnant or having a baby or had like a broken limb. Sometimes kids would be riding along with this and just playing while they were walking.
this is a site of commerce. Commerce always takes place here. Before the military, during the military, and after the military. And the talk today is going to focus more towards that time that the military was here when the post-settler, the post-trader was operating. But really can't talk about that without giving the details of the beforehand. So Fort Laramie actually starts out as privately owned fur trading post. The first one was Fort William, built in 1834 by William Sublette and Robert Campbell. Now Robert Campbell is a name that's going to pop up here a little bit later on the post-trader time too. They establish a post as they're supplying the rendezvous. Robert Campbell stays here for just a few short months, or excuse me, William Sublette only stays a few short months before his business partners kind of push him out. And then a few years later, it's going to change hands. The American Fur Company is going to take over Fort William. And as that wooden stockade begins to rot away, they replace it with an adobe stockade called Fort John. And the American Fur Company will operate that up until 1849 when they sell that building for $4,000 to the United States military. And that's when officially this becomes Fort Laramie, even though Fort Laramie had been applied to the post prior to that as just a common name. Once the Army takes over now, not anybody can come here and operate a commercial business. Now you have to go through the government, through the military, and you have to be appointed to operate on site. So the first person that operates here is John Thomas Tutt. He becomes the post settler in 1849, and one of the first things he does is build a store to operate out of. So this portion of this building that we're in now was built in 1849, the storeroom here. A little bit later on, Tutt will build on the stone section, which is now represented as the post office, which was essentially his living quarters. And this is where he operated most of his business, was out of here. Now, Tutt came in with financial backers. And one thing you'll notice out here is the guys that were out here during the fur trade and the guys that were still out here trading in this area later on during the fort days, they're all interacting one way or another. Two of the financial backers for Tutt is Robert Campbell again, and also Lewis Doherty, who was also operating trading posts in the area during the fur trade era. So Tutt's time is kind of what I consider the most exciting time out here for me anyways, is that's when this place is really a mixing pot of cultures. You had Native American tribes coming in here to trade, Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, Arapaho, Shoshone, Crow, although mostly Lakota and the Northern Cheyenne were most represented here, did most trading. And you had immigrants coming from all over the world. Some were heading for Oregon for land to farm, some were heading for California to find riches and gold, and some were heading for Utah to escape religious persecution. And that had even started before the post-settler time during the fur trade era. The first immigrants started heading for Oregon in 1841. Mormons started heading for Utah in 1847, their idea being that they're going to get out of the United States and go into northern Mexico, the territory that Mexico doesn't really do much with. Well, in 1848 that changed for them because they're in the United States again. So this continues on through the early days of the fort. And there's historical accounts of a mix of cultures here. One woman said that on one counter you would see Lakota Indians speaking with a trader in the Lakota language. On the other counter it would be Cheyenne speaking with a trader in Cheyenne. And in the middle you'd have a hodgepodge of Indian women and immigrants buying goods. Some of the Indian women filling their dresses with flour and corn. It was kind of a peaceful trading place. And all those were, basically making the post-trader money. He had a monopoly out here. So with the Indian trade, it was all in buffalo robes. Which with the Indian trade, it's on a barter system, because if you hand them 3 paper dollar bills, which is the highest price that was paid for buffalo robes, they're going to give you a funny look and then give you the kind of haircut that doesn't grow back. They think they're being cheated. So as a post-trader, you have to know what you were paying for the robes, know what you wanted to get out of your goods, and that's how you would exchange on the barter. So knives are $1.50 a piece. For 2 knives, for 1 buffalo robe, they get 2 knives. Or a hank of blue beads, or white beads. And when I say hank, I don't mean that whole big group there, I mean a single strand of beads is what they get for 1 buffalo robe. Beads are pretty high priced out here, especially blue and white. And if you look at a lot of the Plains Indian beadwork, especially the Cheyenne, blue and white is almost exclusive in a lot of their beadwork until you start getting to the reservation period when their beadwork really explodes.
I have a question.
Sure.
What's the bead? What are the beads made out of out here?
Those are glass. So you can see a major variety of beads, and we've only got a short supply of them. But these were very common. The blue and white, these come from Italy. A lot of them come out of Italy. Now, black, green, red beads, can't really sell those very well out here. The Plains tribes didn't really value those as highly. So for 3 or 4 hanks, you trade for a buffalo robe. The other items that was popular, Northwest trade guns. They're the cheapest gun available out here. It's a 62 caliber smoothbore, basically a 20 gauge shotgun. Those that break 7 to 10 buffalo robes a piece. So at $3 a piece, you're looking at anywhere from $21 to $30 for that, and that's the cheapest gun on the shelf. Well as knives, as I said before, coffee, sugar, tea. Indians would come here and trade for just about anything because they're not going to find a lot of stuff in their natural environment. It was new to them, especially ready-made items. A knife like this, they come in and buy for 1 buffalo robe. It'd take them several days to make one out of flint. And this is easy to resharpen, and it's a throwaway item. When it's no longer usable, just toss it, come buy a new one. Now the other group of people that are trading here, of course, is immigrants coming through. Now in the early 1840s, it was small numbers. The highest I've seen was in the mid-40s was about 5,000–6,000. When they find gold in California in 48, which leads to the 49 gold rush, that number of people starts to spike heavily. And in 1850, anywhere from 45 to 65,000 people come through Fort Laramie. That's not over a 12-month period. That's between the 1st of June and the end of July. That would be the equivalent of the entire population of Cheyenne walking through here over a 2-month period. A lot of people were coming through here. And Tut was still getting his logistics kind of squared away because the goods that were supposed to show up for those 45 to 65,000 people didn't show up until September. By the time you figure the freight in out here, goods are going to cost more. A simple can of corn. Out here at Fort Laramie, you would pay $1 for a can of corn. Back east, you would pay 10, 15, 25 cents, maybe 35 cents in a bag here for that same can of corn. Quite a bit of markup. And it still happens out here in Wyoming today. If you don't believe me, go to a grocery store. The freight that it takes to get it out here, things are still pretty high. The other thing that's going to change under Ward's tenure is relations with the natives. In 1868, the Fort Laramie Treaty is signed here at Fort Laramie, which essentially establishes a reservation system. Pretty much north of the North Platte is unceded Indian territory. Whites aren't allowed to go up in there. And it also states that Indians aren't allowed to come south of the North Platte, which is going to put a strain on the relations here because this is their store where they're going to come buy their goods. Crazy Horse considered this his store, Red Cloud considered this his store, so they would have to come here to get goods. That's going to make things a little bit more difficult for them. And then later on, because of that treaty in 1874, the military is going to wind up establishing Camp Robinson, which is closer to the reservation. Quickly becomes Fort Robinson, and then it's redesignated as Red Cloud's agency. So no longer does he come to get to Fort Laramie to get goods, now he goes to Fort Robinson to get goods. And they weren't very happy about that, but there wasn't much that could be done. And essentially when that happens, you're going to see the post trader completely lose out on the fur trade. Is that going to affect his business in the long run? No. He's got a monopoly out here. Besides the fur trade, what few immigrants are still coming through, he's got hay contracts, beef contracts, lumber contracts, and then in 1883 he's going to have the post canteen system or the post bar. So that was another little change. The Army decided in 1883 that soldiers getting drunk on base was not acceptable. They were getting in trouble. So they banned alcohol on the bases. And not just here, this is military wide. Didn't take long for them to realize that when those soldiers start going into the civilian population now to get their booze, they cause problems there, and that's a little bit more of an issue. So they bring in the post canteen system, what we call the bar. On the south side of this building, You'd have the officer's bar. That's where the finer spirits were sold. Bourbon, whiskey, rye, gin, Taos Lightning, just to name a few. On the north side of the building was the enlisted man's bar. It don't get much stronger than beer over there. And if it's in the summer, it's warm beer, and in the winter, it's cold beer. That's your only choices. Then the place is abandoned. A few years later, 1938, the Park Service comes in, and over the next few years, they began doing their archaeology and then trying to restore some of the buildings. If it hadn't been for John Hutton, we wouldn't have a lot of these buildings here to be restored for you to visit. You'd be visiting just skeletons like a lot of buildings that aren't standing.